Happy Easter. He is risen. It is the great day that we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus from the grave. Another edition of Armchair Theology here. And with a lot of Easter sermons, there's a lot of messages that tend toward apologetics, like proving that Jesus rose from the grave. And some of those are great messages. That's not to knock those. There's lots of excellent sermons out there on that topic. But I'm more interested actually in what the Gospels have to say about the resurrection of Jesus. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the resurrection is mentioned in all four Gospels. And they have some differences between them as we look through them. So I thought I would dive into some of those passages and talk about them here in this video edition. The resurrection is found in Mark 16, 1 through 8. Mark probably being the oldest gospel. Most scholars are pretty unanimous on that Mark was written first. And then Mark, in these passages, has the women Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Salome going to the tomb. And they were bringing spices to anoint Jesus's body according to their cultural customs. It was Sunday, the first day of the week, as it was in all the Gospels when they went to the tomb on Sunday. And they found the stone rolled away. And inside the tomb, there was a young man dressed in a white robe. And the young man said something like, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. But go tell his disciples and Peter," and then also mentioned that Jesus was going ahead into Galilee. So the women went out and fled. They said nothing to anyone, according to this gospel, and they were afraid, as one would tend to be when you laid your friend in a tomb, and then you go there 3 days later, and he's not there anymore, and the stone was rolled away. So Matthew's gospel, this is in chapter 28, 1 through 8, it has Mary Magdalene going to the tomb and the other Mary, which was probably Mary, the mother of James. There was a violent earthquake. An angel of the Lord came down and sat upon the rock, almost a posture of victory. And apparently the women witnessed this, and the angel says, "Do not be afraid, for I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Go tell his disciples he is going ahead into Galilee." So the women hurried away, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to his disciples to tell them the news. That's the Gospel of Matthew. Now in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12, we have similarly, it mentions women taking spices they had prepared and going to the tomb of Jesus. They found the stone rolled away, but they did not find Jesus inside. And then they saw two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning, according to this gospel. And these two men stood beside them, and they announced the famous line from the Gospel of Luke. I love this. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He," meaning Jesus, "is not here. He has risen." So they went back to tell the disciples, and then Luke mentions who the women were. Mary Magdalene again, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and other women as well. So Luke is kind of encompassing that there may have been lots of other people there. It was highlighting 3 women that went to the tomb. It says in Luke, the apostles did not believe these women and thought they were talking nonsense. And so Peter gets up and runs to the tomb himself and witnesses the scene. So that's the end of Luke. And it's worth mentioning that most scholars not only think that Mark was the first gospel, but Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source for their gospels, and there may have been another gospel called Q, which is yet undiscovered, or we never found any physical evidence of it. But as scholars look and compare the gospels, they come up with these theories of how they came to be. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke are called the synoptic gospels. There's a lot of similarities between them. Now we get to John, which is almost unanimously named as being written later, perhaps in the 90s. And John has a little bit of a different take in John chapter 21 through 13. Mary Magdalene, again, goes to the tomb. She's the only consistent figure that's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. The stone was removed. She runs to Peter, and it says the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, and states they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. Where's Jesus' body? It's gone. So John and Peter run to the tomb, and they see inside, and then the disciples went home. It says that the disciple whom Jesus loved saw the scene in the tomb, and then he saw and believed. It adds that in the gospel. And then, so the disciples went home. Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and then she sees two angels who ask her why she is crying, and she mentions again, the Lord has been taken away. And so these are the scenes of that the four gospels set up. And just in the basic, details that I highlighted, you can see there are some variances, there are some nuances and some differences. And I once heard a sermon that was a very good sermon by Seed Church's former pastor, Brent Rood. And he had a great analogy for looking at these four different gospels and how to think about them and the differences that are in them. His analogy went like this. If you went to a Seattle Seahawks game, because where else would you want to go? You want to root for the Seahawks. And let's say someone was sitting behind a field goal post. Someone was maybe then on the 50-yard line, first row, so you could maybe hear some of the players talking and bantering back and forth. And then a third person was way up in the nosebleed section, like way high up in the stadium. Another person maybe was like medium, like in the 200 level, watching the game. And if you ask these four people what happened at that game, there's obviously going to be some similarities. The Seahawks won, hopefully. They all four agree on that. Like all four gospel writers agree that Jesus rose from the grave. But then there's differences based on their vantage points and what they're seeing. Like maybe the guy behind the field goal post, his view is obstructed a little bit. Maybe he misses some details, but he's able to confirm others. The person at the 300 level might not be able, obviously, to hear the players bantering on the sideline, like the person sitting on the 50-yard line that's right there in the first row. So there's different details and different things that are captured in the Gospels, but they all come together to paint a portrait of four people who were witnessing and bearing testimony to the most extraordinary event that has ever happened in human history, the resurrection of Jesus. Paul writes, 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 22, that this was a bodily resurrection, that Christ had literally rose from the grave. He was battling different viewpoints, including in the early church, a viewpoint called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was tied up in a lot of mystery religions that at first were competing with Christianity in the early first century. And you probably heard of the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, and things like that. But Gnosticism basically had as a central tenet that material reality is evil and spiritual reality is good. So there's a thrust to escape the material and go into the spiritual reality. So the church was combating this belief because Jesus bodily rose from the grave. He rose physically and spiritually. It was holistic as he came up out of the tomb and met with his disciples and other witnesses. Now, the kind of body he had, I have no idea, because there are trippy stories such as Jesus walking through walls, and then doubting Thomas putting his finger into Jesus' side to confirm like he is materially actually there, having risen from the grave. So there's stuff that we don't understand that is crazy, but we do know from what the Gospels teach that Jesus, bodily and spiritually, rose from the grave. This is a highlight, this belief. It's a central tenet of Christianity. Jesus rose from the grave. This is what we celebrate on Easter. Romans 10, 9 and 10 and 13, Paul writes again, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and then verse 13, you will be saved. And so this belief about Jesus rising from the grave is a central tenet of someone being saved within Christianity. Like that's the message that Paul was getting across. So it's a hugely important belief. The resurrection has impacted everybody all throughout the world, all throughout these 2,000 years of church history. I want to read a quote by one of my favorite authors, Philip Yancey. It is in a book called The Jesus I Never Knew, which is a book I read in high school and had a huge impact on me. I read it again a couple years ago. It still holds up. There's an amazing quote he has on the resurrection. I want to read it to you. There are two ways to look at human history, I have concluded. One way is to focus on the wars and violence, the squalor, the pain, the tragedy, and death. From such a point of view, Easter seems a fairy tale exception, a stunning contradiction in the name of God, that gives some solace, although I confess that when my friends died, grief was so overpowering that any hope in an afterlife seemed somehow thin and insubstantial. There is another way to look at the world. If I take Easter as the starting point, the one incontrovertible fact about how God treats those whom he loves, then human history becomes the contradiction, and Easter a preview of ultimate reality. Hope then flows like lava beneath the crust of daily life. This perhaps describes a change in the disciples' perspective as they sat in locked rooms discussing the incomprehensible events of Easter Sunday. In one sense, nothing had changed. Rome still occupied Palestine, religious authorities still had a bounty on their heads, death and evil still reigned outside. Gradually, however, the shock of recognition gave way to a long, slow undertow of joy. If God could do that.